Okay, well, good afternoon, everybody from sunny Bangor. We've just been talking about what the weather's like here, the temperature. Unfortunately, I can't tell you what the temperature is. 76 degrees. No, I think that must be Fahrenheit. Anyway, it's warm, and it may well be warm wherever you are. I can see several people in the room, and there are more due to come. First of all, I'd like to welcome our guest speaker, Rebecca Heaton, who also responds to the name Becky, so we'll use that interchangeably, and it's about sustainability. What better time could we have to talk about sustainability, particularly global climate and the impact on the world, than at the moment where there's heat waves. No matter where you are around the world, you may be more used to the heat. We're not here in the UK and Europe, and there's been excessive heat around. So yes, why don't we have the picture of Becky, and there we go, a specialist in integrated land use, nature, forestry, sustainable agriculture and climate change. I think there it is. It says she did a BSc and a PhD in forestry in Bangor.
The BSc was, PhD
yes.
was Cardiff, yeah.
And she's been on the UK Climate Change Committee, advising the government on setting targets and senior sustainability roles across energy and finance. You can read that for yourself. I think now is the time. I'll, as usual, just set the scene with a few slides in a brief overview. The locations of the material are indicated, so you can always go and look for them in your own time. I wanted just to set the scene from, where are we now, 50 years ago, 56 years ago, what's called the modern environmental movement. And the Financial Times had quite an interesting, it can't be 2029, I must have put a typo in there because yeah, we're very forward thinking at Bangor, but I don't think we can predict what the Financial Times will say in 3 years' time. Nevertheless, they, in that article, so the link is correct, even if I've put the date in incorrectly, is the picture on the side. Just to liven things up, I will sing a little of it. And Joni Mitchell said, they paved paradise and put up a parking lot. Yeah, yeah, yeah. You know the song, I'm sure. If we had more time, you could join in. It was about the fact that she'd been to Hawaii. She looked out of the window of her hotel and she could see palm trees swaying in the breeze. But when she looked down, there was an ugly concrete car park, and there's a famous line in the song Big Yellow Taxi where she refers to, they cut them down and then put them in a tree museum and charged people $1.50 just to see them. Well, that was 56 years ago. It wasn't the only song raising consciousness about the problems of environmental degradation, and the reasons in the middle of the slide. People were interested and worried because of some things happening in the States, which in quite quick order led to the US Congress passing the National Environmental Policy Act because of some very significant pollution events that you can read about there. And sadly, there's more, and they've continued around the world. Next slide, please, Sinead. So that was in popular music and in popular print. In 1972, Bourne wrote about Pollute and Be Damned. And it's a text that criticizes society's reckless approach to industrialization. Well, we'll just pollute, we'll be damned later on, but we'll actually produce things now, and people will want to buy them. Resource depletion, waste management, and the long-term influences or consequences of just focusing in the short term. I have a copy of the book by Schumacher. So 1973 gives a little clue as to my age. We're not going to have a contest. And in 1973, I actually have that book with that cover on it. And I've highlighted there, small is beautiful, a study of economics as if people mattered. Well, there's an interesting idea in comparison with large organizations just maximizing profits, as we'll see in a moment. So it was a response to this idea of bigger is better, and it overlapped with many things happening in the 70s, the energy crisis, etc. And then the Times Literary Supplement at the 1995, so 20 years ago, said among the 100 most influential books published since World War II. Next slide, please. Well, it may have been influential, but unfortunately, Jack Welch, who was the CEO of General Electric in the States, didn't necessarily subscribe to those ideas. The picture on the right-hand side is a book by David Gelles, which the man who broke capitalism. He wrote it in 2022, and it's a critique of shareholder value. The whole idea that people who put money into companies, shareholders, and make the investment, should get all the returns, and therefore pollute and be damned if everyone else suffers. Well, at least the shareholders will benefit. He was one of the first, shall we say, glamour CEOs, and his objective was to push General Electric's stock price higher and higher so that the shareholders who invested would benefit, but often at the expense of workers, consumers, and innovation. And he was obsessed with downsizing and eliminated 10% of workers every year, all with a view to claiming to be efficient. And it inspired generations of imitators, and Gelles calls it Welchism. Well, after Jack Welch retired, then in 2001, after he'd secured his pension payments on the basis of what he'd done with shareholder value, he said, actually, shareholder value is a dumb idea, he said in the Financial Times. Shareholder value is a result, not a strategy, and your main constituencies are employees, customers, and your products. Aha, shareholder value is the product of your combined efforts, from the management to the employees. Well, that's rather difficult to say to those 10% of employees that he'd been used to sacking on an annual basis. The article literally in the current Harvard Business Review, bring back managing for value, not just managing for growth and managing for shareholder value, but value for society at large. Mankins and Krupi talk about, over the past 2 decades, managing for shareholder value, which is what Jack Welch espoused, has fallen out of favour, portrayed as out of step with what society wants. Particularly, there's a growing emphasis on ESG, and that's where we're up to. And the next slide, please, talks to us about corporate social responsibility, 1953, which of course actually predates the 1970s, when Joni Mitchell and others were talking, singing, and people were writing. But corporate social responsibility, coined by Bowen in 1953, the social responsibilities of the businessman. I've just reproduced the title. We'll forgive him the gender-specific idea there. He said that the obligations of business people should be to pursue those policies and to make decisions and to follow lines of actions that are desirable in terms of objectives and values of our society. Well, as I say, Jack Welch, some 20, 30 years later, didn't buy into that. It was not the values of our society, it was what the individual shareholders could gain. The idea of corporate social responsibility, CSR, evolved into environmental, social and governance, one of the things we're talking about today. It was promoted through the United Nations report, Who Cares Wins, in 2004. And the interesting thing about it, you can see the cover on the right-hand side, it's published jointly with major financial institutions. So it's getting their buy-in to the idea, who cares wins. So overall, you win because you've got satisfied customers, you've got satisfied employees, etc. And overall, your shareholders benefit because people are buying your products. Finally, in the bottom left-hand corner is the set of Sustainable Development Goals, the 2030 agenda that all UN member states signed up to in 2015, a shared blueprint. And of course, the challenges are to make sure that people have the opportunity to have clean water, education, opportunity for employment, safe conditions in which to live, etc. Action by all countries, whether we label them, I don't like the term developed and developing, but in global partnership. And the slide next talks about, well, what about more recently? Well, more recently, this is my final slide, and then Becky and I will have this conversation. It's interesting, you'll be well aware that in the US, policies have encouraged the opening of drilling for oil, reduced support for wind energy, and indeed for beyond things immediately to do with the environment, to do with those goals of diversity, equity and inclusion. So against that backdrop, and also the constriction of supply chains due to natural events, global tensions, wars that again have closed the Straits of Hormuz. And some people say, well, maybe that's a good thing because we've become less dependent on oil. We've been saying that for quite some time. But there are trends in renewable energy sources in many countries around the world. What's been the response of many corporates to these change in policies highlighted in the top sentence? Well, as the Guardian newspaper said, many corporations are staying below the radar. Corporate America goes quiet. They've decided better not to antagonize the originator of the US policies. Still, there are companies who do buy into this idea of the Sustainable Development Goals, and B Corps are a community of businesses that meet the verified social, environmental, governance standards, and they work to an equitable and fair economic system. You can look them up there. And across certain industries, for example, banking, which many of you will work in, there are the UN's principles of responsible banking, and now the Academy of Responsible Banking, offering training for all levels in banks and financial institutions. So I close that brief introduction with, so what is sustainability? What's sustainability for businesses? Well, Jack Welch believed that sustainability was keep people on the toes, keep growing shareholder value. But what's sustainable for societies at large, including those who suffer from the environmental pollution, the rising levels of sea, etc.? And what about us as individuals? There we are. We'll move into the next slide, which is the conversation with Rebecca. And these are the kind of things that Becky and I discussed. We might talk about, and we might wander off, and you could put questions in the chat area. So put them in the chat area and I'll call them out when we get towards, just have a quick look. Yeah, when we get towards the point of Q&A at the end, and or you could unmute when we get to that point. So I think the first starting point, Becky, is to say we've had people since 1953 saying we ought to behave responsibly, etc. And then we've had very successful businessmen in the eyes of stock markets, the likes of Jack Welch, who've made a lot of money for many shareholders. Incidentally, the share value of General Electric, the share price overall, the valuation has collapsed since. So what drives business actions on sustainability? Do people do it willingly?
So I think just following on a bit from your history, Stephen, I think the drivers have changed over the decades. So I started my career in the early 2000s when having sustainability in your job title was pretty unheard of, really. And then just a few years ago, all big companies were employing chief sustainability officers, often on the executive board as well. So there's been a journey for corporates in this, and I think the drivers have changed over that time. I think the overriding thing is to remember that businesses don't act in a vacuum, and I think it's society and government which have this key role to play in terms of how businesses respond to the sustainability agenda. So early on in my career, one of the first issues I worked on was palm oil when I worked for BP, and that issue had been driven really by media showing deforestation, and also by a couple of companies taking a real leadership role. And some of those companies took that role because they realised this was a significant issue that was causing deforestation. So because they did want to do it, but also because, of course, there was always that risk of reputational impact. But I think really what transformed the corporate sustainability conversation for me is really these global climate agreements, or the COPs as they call them. So COP stands for Conference of the Parties, and every UN treaty has a Conference of the Parties, and we're talking here about the United Nations Climate Change Treaty that had Conference of the Parties, or COPs, for all 195 countries that have signed up to it. And I'm sure you will have heard of the Paris Agreement. This was in 2015, and this is when sustainability really took off. So 195 countries of the world came together and signed an agreement to keep global temperatures well below 2 degrees, but with best efforts to 1.5. And what this showed business was that there was a global will to really act on climate change, and that this was something they would be expected to step up and do, because each of those individual countries had signed this and were then going to have to actually meet their own targets on it. So how are they going to do that? They're going to put that onus on business. But also it became a little bit of an arms race, with lots of different companies suddenly wanted to be seen as a leader in this highly important and public thing. And I think this was the time really that corporate social responsibility moved perhaps from a sighting focusing on diversity or perhaps charitable spending and producing a lovely little glossy separate report each year, or even perhaps looking at a single issue or lobbying on one issue like palm oil. But it really moved then into being integrated into how you manage your business. So sustainability these days for grown-up proper companies is integrated into the entire business strategy. It's not this side little thing that you bolt on. And we've seen that in terms of how companies report now. You're seeing fewer and fewer companies having this separate glossy sustainability report, much more integrated into the main business strategy. So and just to talk a bit about the climate COP. So that was 2015, and by the time we got to Paris, just a few years later, business were all over it. It was absolutely led. To Glasgow, the Glasgow COP a few years later was just led by business making announcements every other day. It was this huge thing, and we saw an explosion in targets being set by businesses, and this was because they were really getting quite competitive about it. So one driver for action is that competitive, wanting to be seen to be doing better or certainly no worse than your competitors, also wanting to work with your government. So in the UK responded to Paris by setting a net zero target in 2019, and so British-based companies, for example, were thinking, right, this is happening. What can we do? We need to work with the government on this. So that also drives that action. I would say a key thing that came out of all of this was something called the Task Force on Climate Change Financial Disclosure. And this has become mandatory in about 2022, but it was something that forward-thinking companies were doing. This framework was set around how companies had to demonstrate that they understood the effect of climate change on their business. So it was about governance, metrics, risks and opportunities. And suddenly this took climate change into the boardroom, because the boardroom knew they had to mandatory disclose on this. And they would be saying, what's all this? What have we got to do? What's this about? And they were certainly very interested. If you can get something into the boardroom, it starts to really, really happen. I'd say that's probably where my career changed a lot, because I was being called in to say, what's this thing we've got to talk about? How are we doing? Where are these risks? It looks like there's real risk. What are we doing about it? So that's some of the drivers for action over my career. But I just want to say more generally, businesses respond to shareholders. We all know that, and that's almost the number one thing, really. And again, I would say after Paris, the whole ESG, so environmental, social governance or sustainability conversation with investors changed. Before Paris, there would be a small team and I would meet them in a little back room. So I'd be the most senior sustainability person within my company. I'd have to meet the shareholders, but it wouldn't be seen as key. After Paris, it became part of the main conversation, and the mainstream shareholder relations people were having to talk about climate change. So it was seen as this existential risk, but also as an opportunity. So disclosure, I think disclosure, so the next one is one of the number one ways that can drive action. Just knowing you have to report about it, knowing you have to count it, knowing that there's a mandatory expectation on you for example, particularly to report what we call the scopes, scope 1, scope 2 and scope 3 emissions. Scope 1 is the CO2 emitted directly from your operations. So if you were a coal power station, you would have a really high scope 1. Scope 2 is the emissions from electricity, heat or steam that you buy, and scope 3 is the biggie that we'll probably talk about later, and that's everything else, all your supply chain emissions, even the emissions from the people driving into your offices from their cars, absolutely everything. But companies are increasingly being expected to report on all of those, and once you start reporting, you know, they say you can't really change something unless you can measure it. I mean, also I think staff engagement, moving on, is an issue. Certainly if staff are vocal enough, it depends a little bit on the company, but absolutely staff engagement can support companies moving more into sustainability. Certainly everywhere I've worked, we've done quite extensive training programs on sustainability because there's been a real demand from staff for that. Competitors, which I've mentioned, and finally customers. So increasingly customers will expect you to be doing more, and some customers will obviously consciously choose from a brand which they see as doing the right thing. That's not across the board. So you can see some niche, you know, you look at perhaps Patagonia, the clothing manufacturer, who stood out for being sustainable right from day one, right from an early stage. So this is what we have to do. But of course, there's an awful lot of clothes sold which aren't Patagonia. So customers can have an impact. So I think that's probably it, Stephen. A very long answer to your question about what drives action, but that's, I think, where I'm at the end of question 1.
Okay, good. I think one of the things to say, of course, is that when we come to talk later about industries, the fashion clothing industry is often, you mentioned Patagonia and things, the brand, not the country, and they're often slated for cheap price, wear it once, it falls apart, and throw it away. But I wanted to ask, with the mandatory reporting and disclosure, for many aspects, certainly in the UK, companies of different sizes have to disclose different things. So for small companies, there's a reduced level of reporting with regard to turnover and things. Do the same regulations for mandatory disclosure apply to companies of all size in the UK, for example?
No, so I'm talking about large listed companies have this really quite onerous reporting burden, but that trickles down. So for instance, one thing I've done in various roles is looking at how we can help those smaller companies or suppliers get the data to us, because if you have to report on all of your operations, you need to understand the operations of your suppliers. What is the carbon footprint of the products that you're buying, that you're then perhaps using or making into something? And so it trickles down across the whole of business. So the onus might not be on you to mandatory report as a small company, but your customers, who, especially if you're business to business, B2B, will need that data and will be expecting you to do it. And I do think we've seen some great examples of large companies going, okay, how am I going to help these smaller companies to really do something? Because we need that data. We can't expect them to do it on their own. And I think for carbon, we're seeing a lot of this now. There's loads of carbon calculators out there. They're relatively simple to use. I'm not entirely sure how accurate they all are, but we are seeing that to help smaller companies provide the data that companies that do have to mandatory disclose receive.
And I think that's perhaps a little similar to responsible banking. Nowadays, the emphasis is not just on what is the bank itself doing in terms of its emissions and its conservation, but increasingly there's an interest for the bank to check what the loans that they are making to companies, even if the company can repay the loan, what damage might it be doing to the environment along the way? That leads us into, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, carry on.
Yeah, I think that leads us into the question quite nicely about what differences are there across sectors. We've mentioned if you're a power plant, you're likely to emit a lot of CO2, perhaps under scope 1. If you're using fossil fuels, we mentioned the fashion industry. What differences are there across sectors? Are there some sectors that it's easier for companies to be compliant?
Yeah, and I'll start with financial services, because you've You've mentioned that already. So, and I would say it's more than an interest in what their clients are doing. The banks have really stepped up, and they signed something called the Glasgow Financial Accord for Net Zero after the Glasgow COP. Now, some of the US signatories to this have left, some of the insurers and banks, but quite a lot of financial services companies are still involved in it. And it was really very, very stringent. And it says that they would set emissions targets for every penny that they lend. So that's more than a passing interest. That's an absolute hard data. And how the banks worked this out would be to first of all, look at each sector, so perhaps the mortgage sector or the agriculture sector or transport sector, or even the SME. So, we've done it where you'll be looking at taxi drivers and hairdressers and small businesses. And you would look at the emissions trajectory for that sector. So, for instance, you might look at UK housing stock and say, right, these are the emissions trajectories for all of those mortgages that I'm lending. And then you would say, what does a 1.5 degree compliant pathway look like? So that means, what do the emissions need to be to keep global warming down below 1.5 degrees? And so that's really highly technical in itself. And then you say, right, okay, and what can I do about that? Then looking at the levers that they have. And so this was really, really quite onerous. And banks have set these targets across all of their sectors, all of the major banks, particularly in the UK, which was quite a leader on this, and now have to look at how they might try and meet them, actually. So I think if you have a mortgage in the UK and you get a letter from your bank saying, here, have a cheap loan to put an air source heat pump in and reduce your CO2 emissions, it's probably becoming because they've signed up to this and they've set these targets. So yeah, a pretty rigorous process that's been put in place there. Can I also talk about sector? I'm going to talk about the energy sector because I think that's one of the most exciting, particularly again in the UK. So I'm talking quite a bit with the UK, but I think where we've seen there is a couple of drivers really all work together very, very well. So if you look at the energy sector, the UK has been really committed to producing renewable energy, and we're a UK leader in offshore wind, a global leader, sorry, in offshore wind, and have about 15 gigawatts. And how did that happen? Well, it was through companies responding both to carrots and sticks from government. And so carrots was something called the contract for difference, which was a guaranteed 20-year contract saying we will give you an uplift on basic electricity prices if you produce it from various renewable sources. And this was quite transformative because it was a bankable contract that you could get finance on. So that worked really, really well. I think another example from the energy sector is really exciting is electric vehicles. So just about 14 or 15 years ago, I remember driving a little EV. I could barely get it across the oil refinery site that I was based on at the time before it went into something called limp home mode. So we just thought, how are these ever going to take off if you can barely do sort of 20 miles? And now, of course, barely, 10 years later, you can do 300 miles and they're becoming absolutely commonplace, and we don't need special finance. You can just walk into a car showroom and you can buy one on any high street in the UK that has car showrooms, which probably isn't so many now. And why has that worked so well? But I think the car manufacturers really responded to the innovation that took place to make these cars much better, but they also responded to the carrot and the stick of government. So the carrot was the fact that there were investments both for development but also for customers to buy these, and the stick was really clear long-term policies on phasing out of fossil fuel vehicles. So I think that's a real case where actually the UK has been quite a leader, and I think it's because of that government intervention there, but obviously society, people picking up and saying, I'm going to do this. And initially these cars were more expensive, so you were doing it probably because you thought it was the right thing. But now it's cheaper to run an electric car than it is to run a petrol or a diesel car. So people are increasingly doing it for economic reasons as well.
That's right. We've got an electric car, but one of the things which some people criticise electric cars for is cheap to run, but expensive for the batteries in terms of the minerals, etc. involved.
Yeah, I mean, with any sustainability, you have to look at the wider picture. So I think do you mean it cost expensive in terms of the ethical cost or expensive in terms of the actual financial cost?
Well, in terms of the amount of time it takes you to and the number of miles you would need to go in order to wipe off the cost of extracting the minerals, etc., etc.
Well, I think that's all caught up in the purchase price of the car. So I think if you look at the, you buy the car and then it's cheaper to run, and all the economics shows it's much cheaper, even with the heavier upfront cost of the car. But now actually we're seeing the upfront costs reduced down so much that some of the cars are now on a parity. So I think it's been really transformational. I did also want to touch on you can have unintended consequences from doing something that's sustainable. Every single decision you make will have a trade-off, and there are concerns perhaps about some of the minerals used in car batteries and where have they come from and are those ethically sourced. I'm increasingly confident that we can be sure they're ethically sourced, but also we're looking at other ways of getting those minerals. For example, in the UK, we're looking at old mines and looking at the lithium we can get out, so we can actually use our own lithium, and increasingly seeing much more on battery recycling as well. So we need to see more on that, I think. But when the batteries perhaps can't be used in cars, actually recycling them and reusing them.
That's right. And one model that I read of recently says you don't buy the battery for the car, you lease it, and then it's expected that you'll return it and it'll be recycled. So indeed, only 20 miles from where I'm sitting now in Bangor, there's a mountain called Paris Mountain, which was a place that set the price for copper, I think it was, in the 1800s, 1700s, the world price for copper, and they're looking to resuscitate that for, minerals, maybe. Yeah, but they've been talking about that for some time. What about fashion, the fashion industry? We've touched upon it very briefly, and perhaps that's something where we all are guilty or not guilty. I'm not fashionable, and on that basis, I don't change my clothes regularly. I do change my clothes, obviously. What I mean is I don't change my fashion regularly. So I wait for it to come back into fashion. And here I am in my waistcoat. But there we go. Many people are not extravagant in their use, but the pricing strategies of some of these companies lead them down that route.
Yeah, I mean, it's really hard, isn't it? I think what I usually talk here about Marks and Spencer's because I think they're a real leader. They developed something called Plan A, and they were really ahead of their time. And that was some years ago. I haven't checked, maybe 7 or 8 years ago, maybe even more than that. And so they are really ahead of their time. And if you buy from M&S, you kind of know that they've had all these processes and accounting and numbers and a focus on it at board level for a long time. I'm actually head to toe M&S today. I think clothing is really complicated because it's such a complex supply chain. So you have crops, so predominantly cotton grown in one country. The material will be made, it will be moved to another country to be woven, it will be moved to another country to be made up into clothing and then sold globally. So they're complex supply chains to get to grips with. But we are seeing companies do that now, particularly responsible companies like Marks and Spencer's, who were also really involved in setting up something called the Better Cotton Initiative. So that was about ensuring that cotton was grown in a way that was better for both the environment and for the social impacts as well. So I think you have to be just quite mindful of this. Yet there are leaders like Patagonia who are saying, don't buy from us. You shouldn't even be buying new things, and you can give stuff back and we will recycle it. So I think there's been quite a change the last few years. I would say it's still probably at the premium end of the market. Perhaps we need to do more about education and helping people understand. When I grew up, you only had 1 or 2 dresses a year. Now it seems to be 1 a week for people. So there's quite a different sort of mental thought process around it as well. So perhaps that's something that some of your students might want to do some engagement on or something. That would be fantastic if we can look at how to get some messaging out on that.
Yes, and I think I don't have 1 or 2 dresses a year, but I do. I'm a customer of Marks and Spencer's. I'm wearing something today, which is not visible. And the good thing about Marks and Spencer's is they have my socks. I'm wearing my socks, and a good thing about Marks and Spencer's is I can go there and they're always going to have what I need, except they've seemed to have stopped doing shirts with buttons. I like shirts with collar buttons. Anyway, by the by, one of the challenges, of course, in the fashion industry, that it's young people. So it's our granddaughter who's 18. They are targeted by the speed of change of fashion, etc., etc. And our granddaughter likes to go to Vinted, I think it's called, and online and things like that.
Yes.
Let's move. Yeah. So we've begun to talk about what actions businesses are taking in the sustainability space, and indeed, Marks and Spencers used to say Plan A because there is no Plan B, and yes. it still is. It still is the case. There is no Plan B. It's unfortunate that Marks and Spencers hasn't been able to get that message, except to the 4 or 5% of the total market that it serves, both in food and clothing. Can you think of other actions that businesses are taking? You've talked about the financial services industry and the accord they've signed. We talked about clothing with Marks and Spencers. Were there any other examples under businesses taking action themselves?
Well, I think I was going to talk more broadly about what the key driver for the key actions that we see really as a chief sustainability officer. It's all about targets and setting these targets. And that's what we're seeing across the whole spectrum of businesses, setting targets. I'd like to see more action on targets. But, if you look at any company report, it's full of targets and what they're going to do and by when. And that is the key sort of action that we see across. And reporting has become huge. Reporting has really taken over a sustainability director's life, as opposed to perhaps the actions that might drive some of that. But I would say it's positive. We have moved from these glossy photos to actual hard numbers. And increasingly, and this is something perhaps for your business students, we are seeing the sustainability data being audited with the same scrutiny as the financial data. So best practice now is to audit all of the environmental data that's published. So I think that again focuses a board's mind on it. And when a board sees these numbers that have been audited, what's behind them, what's going on, and what products and services might we need to actually meet these targets that we've set there. And a lot of this really is following these global standards. And these really have been developed because of greenwashing. So we saw a lot of companies pretending to act, or not lying, but perhaps focusing on the one small green thing they did, which wasn't perhaps material across the whole of a large company. And quite rightly now, the Advertising Standards Association said this is wrong. This is called greenwashing and it's illegal. You have to be really careful how you talk about what you're doing. And that's really meant that we've got a lot of these sort of global standards being developed. And the key one is something called the Science-Based Target Initiative. 4,000 companies have signed up to this. And these are these very, very tough, validated targets around what companies are doing, predominantly on climate change, but increasingly moving into other areas as well. I would say since recent politics, perhaps some companies have pulled out, less is happening, but there's a growth on it, and the growth is in Southeast Asia. So I think Europe, US led the way. Now we're seeing Southeast Asia really come up and start signing up. If you've signed up to this Science-Based Target Initiative target, you're really, really serious about your company and what you're doing. So what else actions businesses take? I would say increasingly we're seeing sustainability linked executive pay. That's been a thing for quite a while now. So looking at senior exec pay, you have a scorecard within any business and you say, how are we going to pay these senior leaders bonuses? And you're having a percentage on profit, health and safety probably, and increasingly sustainability is now on that. And that's great because that really does drive the actions that we need. And just going on about reporting, we're increasingly seeing a move from just setting targets. So the target craze was kind of in the early 2020s to actually moving to what we'd call climate transition plans. And again, these are mandatory in some jurisdictions. It's a very much a moving space at the moment. And that's the route to achieve the targets. And that's where you see innovative new products, etc. I think we're also increasingly seeing a focus on nature that I'll probably talk to in a minute, but this climate transition really encompassing how the whole business is going to move to manage the risks and the opportunities. And also quite a key part of this is governance as well. So I mentioned at the beginning, TCFD, the Task Force on Climate Related Financial Disclosure, how governance was part of that. Within businesses, you're increasingly seeing now dedicated committees responsible, either a responsible business at a board level or an executive committee that are really focused on getting this right. So it's getting that same scrutiny that perhaps an audit or a risk committee would get. So that's more about the internal actions that you see businesses taking, a lot of it led by people like me inside clamouring for change and trying to make that happen by using all of those tools available to you, like exec remuneration, like governance, like mandatory reporting.
Yes, and you're right that it was you that introduced Marks and Spencers, so I'm not here sponsored by Marks and Spencers. But indeed, when you see their trucks going past, it often's written on the side, and you can see in the shape of the bodywork that it's aerodynamically designed in order. And then even McDonald's says that they use their recycled cooking oil, etc. So yeah, large companies are moving in that way. I think when I say it's about visibility in Southeast Asia, where I go regularly, the Singapore, which has been a very successful economy and society, but it can't stop pollution coming at certain times of the year on the winds that come from farmers who are cutting down forest in Indonesia in order to plant, I think often palm oil and things to gain better returns, and the smog is horrendous, and the respiratory problems. So that draws attention to these challenges and how they're difficult to stop at a border. What could encourage businesses to do more, Becky?
Well, I'm going to say a bit about the palm oil issue, because that is a lot of that is the public, actually. So I think the public do have a role here. We all do have a role. So I worked on palm oil in the early 2000s, and Unilever, global company, set up something there called the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil, because they saw it as a reputational and a leadership opportunity for them. And they're now doing something called Beyond Palm Oil. So they've gone even beyond. And if you look at palm oil, it's not been entirely successful. It's been successful for Western European markets where it is that purchasing power of consumers have said, we don't want to buy things with unsustainable palm oil in, and that's really worked. It's not been so successful, so companies will sell perhaps their unsustainable palm oil to other markets where there isn't that societal pressure. So I would say I think societal pressure really does have a role. We've been talking a lot about government, but what role do we have as society? I'd also say in the UK, when the UK Parliament was debating setting a net zero target, there were protesters on Westminster Bridge campaigning, and you couldn't walk across Westminster Bridge, and it was on the news. It was something called Extinction Rebellion. So that direct action, I am sure that influenced some of those politicians sitting there in that debating chamber, knowing that was happening outside. So I think society does play a role. We are seeing this pushback. And the pushback is a little bit from society because, of course, there's real cost of living issues. We've got wars going on. We're in quite a different place. Where does sustainability fit into that? I think we've also seen a bit of a pendulum, actually. So we had the sort of high of the Glasgow Agreement and setting these targets, for those banks, setting these targets over every penny they lend. They're over things that they don't necessarily have a lot of control over. Do they have control over how you heat your home with your mortgage? No, not really. And so I think perhaps that pendulum, it was felt, may have gone a bit too far, and it's swinging perhaps a little bit back the other way. So, what can we do, and what can we do to encourage businesses to do more and to find this sort of balance in the middle? And I think if you are, based in a business, that's what I've done my whole career, really, sustainability within a business, integrating it into your business activities is key. I've never really been successful on anything if you haven't had a commercial business case. So that's a business case for doing something, to have an initiative, or a reason to stop doing something. And if it's stop doing something, say in a bank, it could be if you stop lending your money to these people, you will end up being able to lend more money to these other organisations which will want to bank with you because you aren't doing the other bit. So I think that commercial business case is key, and that can rest either on risk to your reputation, risk to your business. So are you lending to areas which inherently aren't going to survive the physical impacts of climate change? Is it reputational, or is it just that there's some income that you can generate? I also think, something that discourages businesses from doing more is the quarterly earnings cycle, having to report on quarterly earnings, and also CEO tenures. I think the average tenure of a CEO in the FTSE 100 is something like 5 years, might even be a bit less. And so a CEO comes in, and it might be all guns blazing, thinking, I'm going to do this, and sustainability too. And then 3 years in, the economic reality hits, and sustainability can often cost money, and then we will get benefits. But are those benefits going to come in the next 2 years remaining of that CEO strategy? Probably not. And so I think that's a real issue too, in terms of just inherently how the business world is set up. So I think it's no surprise when I look at the UK at some of the real leaders in sustainability. And I would say two leaders there are the Grosvenor Group and the Crown Estate. For those of you not based in the UK, these are both organisations which have a really long-term view. Grosvenor has been owned by the same family for 400 years. So there's a very long-term view here about long-term sustainability, and the Crown Estate also very much in that place. And they are really pushing it because they're trying things out, they're doing things, and perhaps they don't have that sort of 3 to 5 year CEO tenure. I also think another thing that's a bit of a barrier for business can be fiduciary duty. With sometimes that, are there better ways to make money than doing sustainability? Yes, there might be. So if you have a fiduciary duty, which you might as a pension company, that can sometimes stop you from doing things as well. So how can we encourage businesses to do more? I think we have the power of us as individuals, both in our vote, how we vote for which government, our shopping, our choices, but also what we do in the workplace. So as an employee, you can also have a real say in terms of every town hall you go to. Ask a question about sustainability, get it on that CEO's agenda. That can really, really help. So yeah, I think that's just some of the things that you as an employee might want to consider.
Great. And if we consider higher education as an industry, which of course it is, then
yeah.
Bangor University is doing quite well in the rankings, in some rankings for sustainability. And when you say that in some countries there's not societal pressure, well, then there's a slight pause and we add the word yet in the hope that eventually there will be. What's next on the sustainability horizon? You've mentioned there's risk in terms of reputational risk, and certainly recently in Southeast Asia, I was talking to a bank and they said, yeah, we used to lend money to buy earth moving equipment for companies in Indonesia, and then realized that they were ploughing using this equipment to knock down primary jungle and plant, etc., etc. So there's an example. The climate as a business risk goes beyond reputational risk in terms of, I suppose, source of materials and availability. What else can we talk about? And we covered a couple of things when we spoke previously: business resilience, and then the exciting area of financing adaptation.
Yeah, I think increasingly coming up the agenda is the fact we're all seeing the impacts of climate change now. So although we've all had the models, we've all known the physical impacts within the business. I think it's now because people are just seeing it on a day-to-day basis and becoming much more aware of it. So businesses really managing that risk, financing the adaptation. I think also I'd say the climate models are getting a lot better as well. So we've got a much clearer idea of, if we have a weather event, was that caused by climate change or not? And also, what is the future going to look like, and much more certainty over what that looks like. But I do actually want to talk about nature. So nature is increasingly coming up the agenda. So in the way that we had the United Nations Paris Agreement, there's been a similar one for nature, which was signed in 2022, the Biodiversity COP, and it's the Global Biodiversity Framework. So that was signed in 2022 by, again, about 195 countries, saying we're going to protect nature. It's had various parts to it. I think there were 22 things, but one of which was mobilizing money to protect nature, and also protecting 30% of land by 2030. Businesses are really seeing ecosystem collapse, particularly agricultural businesses. So someone once said to me, so what's the fossil fuel equivalent of nature? And I said, it's probably agriculture, really, in terms of businesses most impacted, but also perhaps most responsible as well for some of this. So we are seeing reporting coming in. So there's frameworks for reporting about nature, and increasingly those are being talked about becoming mandatory. So that will obviously drive this at a board level. It's very much linked to climate change because there's things you can do with nature which will help you solve some of your climate resilience issues. So nature-based solutions. This is the real hot topic at the moment. So that crossover between climate and nature. And what are the opportunities, say, for green finance, both for land-based industries, but also we're seeing financial instruments and investment vehicles in this as well. So I think I'm seeing nature and its link to adaptation and climate change perhaps being the number one thing that's on board agendas in the sustainability space. It's also one that I think is particularly more engaging than climate change. So boards are a little bit more excited about it. There's unfortunately, I have to say, a little bit better PR from standing in a field with some trees, perhaps. So all you Bangor foresters, I'm not sure any are listening in today, but very much part of this climate solution as well.
There you are, banging the drum for your initial studies and things like that. I think when you talk about farms and agriculture, of course, we're surrounded in Northwest Wales with farms of various kinds, not just livestock, but crops, etc. And earlier on, you talked about some of the organisations who are able to escape the quarterly earnings cycle and the short tenure of CEOs. Did you mention the Grosvenor Group of the
yes.
landed estates which are just in Chester along the coast? And these 2022 biodiversity you were talking about, are they for the very large landholders who buy up farming land, etc., or for the farmer who's got a couple of hundred acres? What do they do?
Well, I mean, it's a really complex space, isn't it? And there are trade-offs here. If you want to get a carbon credit, you would just plant a conifer plantation. But if you want to do something for biodiversity, you might plant an oak woodland if you want a nature credit. And then where does the people fit into that? Where do the communities? So to do this right will be complicated. It really will be. And we're just talking about UK, but obviously we're a very small country, so our landmass isn't big. We want to produce food, we want to produce timber, we want to protect nature. How can you balance all that? So that's going outside a little bit of the business. But I think some businesses have gone in and it hasn't gone well, and have bought up land and have just done, not being great with the local communities. So I think there's an awful lot we can learn about trying to do this in the right way. But I would also say it's quite a global issue as well. So there's very few companies which are probably just solely sourcing and supplying from within the UK. So most will have a global footprint and are looking at the impacts of their operations on nature globally. You tend to start with deforestation because that's one where, again, there's quite a lot of regulation, particularly in the EU with something called the EUDR. But that's probably the most obvious one. But now we're sort of moving into, well, what are the other effects on biodiversity? What are the effects of pesticides? And what if I don't do anything? Am I going to have ecosystem collapse and not be able to source those products, particularly say for cosmetics or the health industry?
Yes, and we were driving down to see our grandchildren 20 miles south of Bangor over the weekend and noticed that one of the hillsides had been the conifer trees, which had been planted I don't know, after the war or sometime, had been cut down, and we wondered, I wonder what will be replacing them. Will they be going for people who, as you just mentioned, are looking for the quick fix in terms of getting grant? I think we've gone around the subject, and your comments about what do we do takes us back to Schumacher. 1973, not Michael Schumacher, the racing driver who might have caused pollution, although Formula One, I'm sure, is trying very hard. But the book that I introduced to you at the very beginning, Small is Beautiful, a study of economics, as if people mattered. And that was your final comment. What does it do to the communities and societies? So that's great. Thank you for that. And it's now time for people to ask their questions. It's much easier if you pop it in the chat so I can have a look at it and read it out. Then we'll have just a little bit of a session about how you can join our programs. Bob Souster, who's a good friend of our activities here and has been on our program teaching for some time. I think consumers and other stakeholders are becoming more aware of the fiduciary reach of companies, extending to our young people. So younger people, we shouldn't presume that they're always changing clothes and things and doing things that are environmentally unfriendly. They're certainly aware of it, but as we said, talking about Marks and Spencer's, perhaps they don't have the spending power at this stage. But we can hope that they keep those ideals. The pushback, says Bob, is most visible among social media with older demographics. Must be the ones I read. Older demographics, Bob. What are you talking about? Facebook as older? That's the only one I've got. You mean there are others? Oh my goodness! And I've never posted on Facebook. I just watch. It's essentially reactionary and yearning for what was. Oh, I've got my rose-tinted glasses on, Bob. Thoughts on that, Becky?
I don't know whether I'm old or young, really. I'm probably old, but definitely old. But am I older? I don't know. I don't do Facebook either. But yeah, it's a really good point. I think there's a lot of people who are absolutely engaged on this. You know, I learned so much from younger generations. I was on one board where we actually set up a youth board because we felt that was so important to understand that. So yeah, bring on some youth shadow boards in terms of very good corporate governance, I think, and get those voices in the room.
Yes, and with regard to who's old, I cite from a book that my wife bought me called Outlive, The Science and Art of Longevity. And it's actually written, but not exclusively, about individuals. But I think it applies to organizations, and that's when I cite it. And on page 411, all rush out and get the book, it says, I think people get old, and by extension, I think organizations get old, when they stop thinking about the future, it says. If you want to find someone's true age, etc., listen to them. If they talk about the past and they talk about all the things that have happened, rose-tinted glasses in Bob's view or statement, they've got old. If they think about dreams, aspirations, and what they're still looking forward to, they're young. And I think that applies to organizations as well. Let me have a look now. Any other questions? Come on, let's have some questions from you. There are people in the room who I'm sure have got thoughts. We're not old, Stephen, right? Mature and wise. Well, let's cling to that, Bob, and we won't accept any comments on whether we are. Sounds like a wine. What other questions have we got? You've talked while people are thinking about putting things in the chat area. Becky, you've talked about your own journey and the profile now of having, did you call them chief sustainability officers or whatever?
Yeah.
What's the best way into, suppose, for our students, many of whom will listen to this in the recording phase, they want to get into that? Should they come from a science background? Because you did talk about the, what was it? You talked about science-based targets that are measurable. You talked about, should people come from a science background or from a business background or what?
I think business background's great, and particularly accounting. So increasingly all of those science-based targets, it's just numbers, and it's increasingly all that reporting is being moved into finance. So we're seeing accountants play a really important role in terms of those sustainability roles. I think we're seeing actually a move away now from chief sustainability officers and more about sustainability being integrated across the whole of a business. So you will have a small dedicated central team of real sort of sustainability experts, but there will be lots of roles in all other bits. So you might in a bank have a head of sustainable lending, looking at lending, you know, setting perhaps green bonds, for example. So focused on, say, a renewable sector or a nature sector, but a banker nonetheless. And then you might have your reporting team or your accountants really focusing on some of those sustainability disclosures that have to be done. So I would say, or you might have an HR person really focusing on engagement around this, you know, training around sustainability. So I don't think you necessarily need to have a dedicated sustainability qualification, but I think you can find your route within a large organisation, certainly into the roles that you would like to do in this space.
Yes, and I think what we've been talking about is how it's become a cross-cutting theme rather than just, as you said, something on the sidelines of conferences. I was a little disappointed in the latest COP that I think I saw a report. It was in Brazil, wasn't it, I think? And a report that said actually there were more lobbyists and against responsible behaviour than many of the groups, companies sent lobbyists, etc. And so the message hasn't reached everyone yet, has it? But the emphasis is on the word yet. Let me check again for any further questions. I think there's a lot of food for thought there, Becky, and people will take time to digest it. And if it's okay, if they come back to us with questions, we'll forward them on as part of an ongoing dialogue. But it remains for me to thank you very much for your contribution. We're just going to say a little bit about the program and that we have. And there we go. Shannon's put it up. The Chartered Banker MBA has a long history, some 15 years or so, and it's a dual qualification, Chartered Banker MBA from Bangor University, founded in 1884, traditional research-based university, and a professional qualification, the Chartered Banker. In there, one of the most popular modules is Green and Sustainable Finance. Green and Sustainable Finance. So there are various entry routes into the Chartered Banker MBA, depending on your years of experience and what else you've studied. In the Financial Crime and Compliance MBA, which is not teaching people to be criminals, but teaching them to be compliant, and indeed the Illicit Finance MBA, which is a parallel to the financial crime, but particularly focusing on national security, there are references to environmental crime and how institutions respond or do not respond, including governments and corporations, and in some cultures, the role, unfortunately, of corruption and the fact that transnational organized criminal gangs are very fast to adjust their operations much quicker than the regulators and legislators can often keep up. That's equally has a dual qualification. It's globally unique in the world, the only one with an MBA from a traditional research-based university, Bangor, and the designation there of financial intelligence specialist offered by our partner, whose material we use, our partner Manchester CF, based out of Canada. There's a certificate, postgraduate certificate in bank management and technology. I've mentioned that there are different routes onto these programs depending on your previous experience, qualifications that you may have, but also at the bottom I want to draw your attention to single module study. Almost all of our delegates who come on our executive education programs in the business school are in work, so they're balancing work with studies, family responsibilities, etc. And the program, the Chartered Banker MBA, is graduated over the 15 years, heading towards 1,500 students from around the world who've been able to cope and balance between work and study and their other responsibilities. So it's a proven platform, and it cuts across all of those studies there. And it's available if you just want to try one module as an attempt to see, could I return to study? We're used to helping people return to study after some period out of education. And also, can I balance the time with my other responsibilities? We had graduation last Wednesday, it was, and I was talking to some of the graduates. Now that you've finished your studies, what are you going to do with all that time that you've got spare? Some of them said, well, family already have a big long list of things that I've got to do. But of course, some of them want to go on to continue further study. But if you're wondering about it, but aren't sure about the time commitment, consider the single module study. And the final slide tells you how to get in touch with us. So the next slide, I don't have power. Thank you. Applications are invited for October 2026. There we are. You can find ways to get in touch with us there, and they're flexible, they're online, and the evidence, the examples I've been given are about people who can balance work with study and with social responsibilities. They're innovative and they are globally unique with dual award qualifications. There we are. I hope that whether you're listening to a recording or you're in the room, you've learned a lot more about sustainability. I certainly have, even though I had that book, Small is Beautiful. So thanks to Becky for all of that insight. Lots of food for thought. It's a growing area, developing area. Thanks, Becky.
Thank you very much.
And yeah, if you have any questions that you couldn't quite formulate during the meeting, send it along to us at that address there, and we'll forward it on and find a way to get a response back to you. So thank you very much, everybody, for attending. Thank you again, Becky, and thanks to colleagues for organising and managing the presentation of the slides.